You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is author, theologian, and cultural critic Dr. Tara Isabella Burton. Tara has written 5 books, including 3 novels and 2 nonfiction books. Her debut novel, Social Creature, was named a Book of the Year by the New York Times, New York's Vulture, and The Guardian. In addition to this, her writing has appeared in publications like the New York Times, National Geographic, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Tara's second nonfiction book, Self-Made, Creating Our Identities from Da Vinci to the Kardashians, traces the myth of the self-made person from the Italian Renaissance and the idea that genius can make you a star, through the dandies of England and France, to the you can do anything if you work hard enough slogan in the US, to the Hollywood star, to modern-day internet influencers famous for inhabiting their brand, and everything in between. It's a wonderfully researched book designed to make you think about what makes someone self-made. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce Dr. Tara Isabella Burton. Hello, Tara. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm really excited to talk about this book because there's so much in it. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I'm Tara Isabella Burton. I'm a writer. I wear multiple hats. In one life, I am a novelist. In another life, I'm a theologian and a culture critic. I write about religion, spirituality, and what that looks like in the age of the internet.
It's fascinating. Do you have a connection yourself to Paris or to France?
I do. I lived in Paris as a kid, the first time when I was 5 or 6 years old, the second time when I was 13. And then my doctoral research, which I did in the UK, was about late 19th century French dandyism and its relationship to Catholicism. So having both an intellectual and a personal interest in Paris, and I'm back a couple of times a year to visit friends.
That's amazing. And when you come back, are you coming back to Paris itself?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about this book and what it's about?
Absolutely. So Self-Made is an intellectual history of the idea of self-creation. The self-made man, or more recently in history, the self-made person more broadly. And historically, the self-made person comes in 2 flavors, so to speak, in terms of the cultural myths and stereotypes surrounding them. There's the self-made man, the entrepreneur, the bootstrapper who comes from nothing or very underprivileged background, but rises through the ranks and makes money and fortune. And then there's the figure of the dandy, the elegant being who creates their life as a work of art, who is self-made in the sense of really creating their own identity aesthetically. And in Self-Made, I argue that these 2 seemingly opposite figures, the entrepreneur and the dandy, are actually 2 sides of the same coin. And both of them represent these wider changes historically from about the Renaissance well into the present day, where in a time of increased social mobility and a time of the decline in power of traditional institutions like the Catholic Church and indeed various monarchies, this idea that the self didn't just have the opportunity to create their own path or create their own story, but the obligation that what makes us human is the act of deciding who we want to be. This becomes more and more a part of all of our lives and who breathe this cultural air, and ultimately culminates in the age of the internet with the kind of frenetic obsession with personal branding and self-making for both economic and aesthetic reasons that many if not most of us, are in part or in whole required to do by the world of the internet and the attention economy.
Where did the idea for this book come from, and why did you decide to bookend it, at least titularly, with Leonardo da Vinci and Kim Kardashian?
As I said, I did my doctoral research in 19th century French dandyism. So this was always a personal love of mine. I was one of those teenagers who was really into Oscar Wilde, and from there to Gizmo and Barbie d'Aurevilly and all these figures. When I left academia, I always knew that I wanted to go back to these figures and explore them. Separately, career-wise, since finishing my doctorate, most of my work was on the present day. My first nonfiction book, Strange Rites, was about the spiritual but not religious in the internet age, and the idea that people were kind of increasingly, as fewer and fewer of us are members of established organized religions or understand ourselves as traditionally religious, we kind of make our own religions, or we're more likely to mix and match our practices in ways that best suit us, that we have a sense of ourselves, and authenticity is something that happens when we look inward. And when I came back to that material, thinking about what I wanted to do after Strange Rites, I realized that there was a really strong connection between this particular intellectual interest in dandyism and this broader intellectual project of what is going on in the internet age, which is this idea that we see elements of ourself as sacred or even divine that are not necessarily the elements of ourselves that would be seen as most fundamentally who we are 300 or 500 or 1,000 years ago. That there really has been a shift in thinking of ourselves primarily as members of communities or clans where our identities are fundamentally given to us. They're not something we choose, to a broader cultural sense that who we choose to be, the decisions we make, the desire that we have to be a certain way or to be understood a certain way or live a certain kind of life or have certain kinds of success is a stronger and more reliable key to who we quote unquote really are than, the circumstances of our birth, say. And I think a lot about Oscar Wilde's famous quote that you give a man a mask and he shows you his face from another point of view. This idea that there's in artifice, in creation, in the act of choosing to show the world we want to be, there is something that is more truthful than seeming apparent truth. And that's a real through line that helped me combine some of my more specific interests with this general intellectual project.
It is fascinating, the evolution of the perception not only of how we value ourselves, but how others in society value us has changed from the time of someone like Da Vinci, who was valued for having been a genius, to someone who just fully crafts their own image and creates sort of a cult around themselves, like someone like Kim Kardashian or Donald Trump, who's someone you mention a lot in the end of the book as well.
Da Vinci, I think, is the best known example of a very particular kind of Renaissance vision of the genius. And what's interesting about the Renaissance genius is that he's kind of, and it's usually he, kind of a liminal figure. He's not exactly part of the social order because he is not born an aristocrat. He confuses understandings of the social imaginary as a world where everyone has their destined place, where kind of God has put them there. And Da Vinci, like many of the sort of paradigmatic Renaissance geniuses, was also famously a bastard. He did not have an established legal father. And some kind of motive that starts around the Renaissance genius is that, sure, their legal father, their biological father is whoever, someone who is humble, but that their real father, their real parentage is somehow nature or fortune or God, that they're liminal beings. And I think that this understanding of some people having a secret godlike identity is really important to the history of self-making, precisely because I think there is absolutely a narrative of self-making, which is a story of liberation and democracy. It's the self-making you see in, for example, the speeches of Frederick Douglass, the idea that you can free yourself from certain kinds of oppression by envisioning a world where only what you do matters and not how you were born. But in fact, historically, if you look at the narrative of self-making, it's not quite so liberatory. It's not quite so progressive. Often it's an attempt to identify people who are socially mobile, give them a particular status, and then kind of pull up the ladder from under them. That there's a certain kind of person who is special and who is godlike, who gets to do this thing. And then there's everybody else. The mob, the normies, the sheeple. Different eras have different ways of talking about it. But that there's a real distinction between the genius, the self-maker, and the normal person who doesn't get to change or decide on their life, whether it's in some narratives because they just don't work hard enough, or because in some narratives because they just don't have that special something. So it's both a reactionary and a liberatory narrative at the same time. Now, I have to admit, most of my Renaissance chapter focuses not on Da Vinci, although he's the better known name and the better known example, but on Albrecht Dürer, the German painter who, like Da Vinci, is absolutely an artistic genius. But even more than Da Vinci, really gets at the way that celebrity and self-promotion go hand in hand with this vision of the genius god. He's often referred to as the author of the selfie, or the artist who invented the selfie. All of his self-portraits, which are incredibly lush and luxurious, depict him as something between a prince and Jesus Christ. He depicts himself in these traditional poses that were once reserved for Jesus. And he gets his own printing press, so he's able to kind of create his designs and have other people share them in a very particular way. He uses technology, but he creates a personal brand. And while Da Vinci is the better known figure, and indeed was himself historically quite a canny self-promoter, it's really Dürer who understands that in this changing world where social mobility is possible, the innateness of genius also involves a little bit of playful deception, of shaping the perceptions of others and using that as part of the creation of one's own identity. Now, Dürer was still an extremely good painter. He was also an artistic genius, very importantly. He wasn't simply famous for being famous. But I think that as this idea of shaping perception being what matters, and that the real power is to convince people of things, essentially, we see this idea of the self-maker morph from someone who is uniquely talented or even divinely talented, like the Renaissance genius, towards famous for being famous. The post-Andy Warhol vision of celebrity where you don't really make anything. Maybe you don't even do anything. You just simply are yourself, and the performance of yourself is the totality of your self-making. And in the Kim Kardashian, I think here, all of the Kardashians, but particularly Kim, are, regardless of their personal talents, whatever they may be, were watershed figures in the cultural consciousness for a celebrity that didn't seem to be based on anything. I think of Barbara Walters famously interviewing them and saying, you don't sing, you don't act, you don't dance. Like, what do you do? And the answer is they are themselves, or they are constantly performing as themselves. And that is the be-all and end-all of their celebrity in a way that has been proven extremely successful and compelling to so many people.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may enjoy our sister podcast, Molly on a Trip, Music Around Paris, which is brand new to the Paris Underground Radio Podcast Network. Molly sits down with local French artists or touring musicians from all over the world to talk about what's going on in their careers and what inspires them. Get insights into what these musicians love most about Paris. Check out Molly on a Trip, Music Around Paris now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. There's an impressive amount of research in this book. I can't even begin to imagine the source material. You have everything from books to essays to magazines to film to television to political propaganda. Can you talk about some of the research you did?
It was a particularly difficult book to research, in part because I signed the contract to do it in summer 2020, which meant that the first year, and really year and a half, I couldn't go to a library. I was very dependent on books that were available as ebooks. And actually, I was very fortunate that it was by early 2021, many university libraries, et cetera, had digitized huge parts of their collection. So that simultaneously, in some ways, it was more difficult to do research. In other regards, I actually was able to get, for example, academic books or monographs that I might not otherwise have had access to. But I actually went back to Oxford in spring, summer 2022. I was on a research fellowship at Oriel College that allowed me use of the entire Bodleian Library, which was extremely helpful after only being able to work with online texts and kind of having to do the dance of identifying something and finding a copy of it when I couldn't leave my apartment. It was nice to be able to have the resources of a university library again. But some of the research of this book, luckily, had been done years before. My work on particularly Oscar Wilde and the 19th century French dandies was drawn from my doctoral research. Some of my work on the New Thought tradition and the Gilded Age was downstream of research that I had done for Strange Rites. So I wasn't starting from scratch, which was good, especially given the timing. But it did sometimes feel like I was doing various crash courses in different pockets of history, particularly for chapters like the Renaissance chapter that didn't necessarily fall within my existing scholarship. So it was quite the process.
I mean, it just seems, in reading the book, it seems unfathomable, really, because there's just so much information, and you pull from a number of different countries as well, and all of these different time periods, and you include all different sources. It's not just like, here are some books that people read or some things that showed up in magazines. It's really like a very comprehensive exploration of the subject. So it's, I guess, reassuring to know that you had already done some of this research before, because I can't imagine being able to create something so dense just on its own.
It was, well, I guess, couldn't really do very much else for a while. So it was at least it kept me occupied.
So it seems like there are two major questions that come up over and over again when we're thinking about what makes someone self-made, at least historically. And one seems to be the relationship to one's God, and the other one seems to be to one's own sexuality, even more than one's relationship to money. And do you think that's true? Did I read that correctly?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And these two relationships sort of actually historically do go hand in hand. Where, and this is obviously the like reductionist 30-second version of it, but I think loosely speaking, in, let's say, the West, just to sort of narrow down what we're talking about here, you probably, whether you were a peasant or an aristocrat or what have you, you probably understood yourself primarily in relationship to not just to God as a figure out there, but to a world that God had created. That the world, nature, as well as society, were fundamentally orderly. They operated the way God wanted them to operate. And so, however you were born, whether you were a peasant or a king, that was something that was part of a plan that had been decided for you. Now, around the time that, for various reasons, the Catholic Church and subsequently Christianity more broadly start going into decline, the Protestant Reformation being one of many factors, later the philosophical European Enlightenment. But increasingly, there became this sense of what I call in my book, the disenchantment of custom, which is the idea that these things that we do, these things that make our social lives, maybe they're not sacred, maybe they're not divine, maybe they're not real in the sense of having a kind of weight. Maybe they're just random. Maybe they're just custom. Maybe they're just what we do. There's a huge genre particularly in the French Enlightenment, of literature that's basically traveler's tales that's inspired by the so-called discovery of the so-called New World. But this idea that encounters with non-Western people somehow show the Europeans that, like, if they do things there like this and we do things here like that, like, who's to say who's really right? And this is, I mean, often this literature is not particularly accurate when it comes to the practices of the people it claims to represent. It's, you know, this literature is more about shining a light on Europe than it is on shining a light on non-Europeans, as it were. But this whole kind of idea becomes, what if this stuff is just stuff we could choose? And you find this in Montaigne, you find this in Diderot. But one of the real fields where this tension becomes pertinent is indeed sexuality and sexual freedom. From the Enlightenment onwards, there's this whole genre of pornographic novels that are like free-thinking novels. Libertine or the libertine comes from this word for the free-thinking, basically atheists who are arguing against certain kinds of government repression and church repression. And these things sort of seem to go hand in hand, that there's a sense of like the authorities, particularly the Catholic Church, are telling you what to do, particularly around what you want, your desires and your sexuality. And that liberating yourself from these expectations is part of a wider political liberation. And that's something that we see consistently throughout so much of dandy culture from the 18th century onwards, that sexual freedom is a huge part of the presentation of freedom as in a personal brand. And this doesn't necessarily mean anything about someone's personal life or sort of private sexual practice. I'm actually talking here about the kind of the sexual public persona. Although an example here is like the writings of the Marquis de Sade, who, of course, in his private life was also extremely troubling in his behavior, but where these kind of horrible accounts of torture and rape and horrible orgies. Like I think there's a misconception that de Sade is just like an exciting, sexy libertine who just wrote sexy books, which is what the film Quills really wants us to think. But actually, like, I don't recommend anyone read anything by de Sade. It is tough going. But that what he's doing in these novels, if you can call them novels, isn't just trying to titillate. It's celebrating this idea that, like, our minds can conceive of anything. Our minds can conceive of the craziest, most transgressive, sickest shit. And that is what the power of humanity is what we can conceive of. You know, if there's no God to tell us what to do or what to think, we can be our own gods, and sexual freedom becomes one of the ways that we demonstrate that we are not foolish sheep who simply does whatever we're told. And you can see this sort of slightly sexually transgressive streak in different ways in the personae of some of the dandies of the late 19th century, who often play with gender, but also play too with this idea of sexual disengagement, that they're beyond sex because they're beyond human relationships. They're gods rather than mere mortals. Or you see this in like the public sexuality of someone like a Mick Jagger-esque rock star, that there's playing with sex as part of your celebrity brand becomes a way of saying, I am one of the special self-makers who is above these boring rules, not one of the boring bourgeois people who does what I'm told.
You also raise a really interesting question about the middle class in your book. Sometimes the relationship of the self-made person to the middle class, sometimes the middle class is reviled, sometimes they're catered to. And right now in our contemporary world, it seems like absolutely everyone thinks that they can become a self-made star with a few well-placed TikToks. What do you think that says about today's middle class?
I worry, like, I think there's a version of the narrative that says, isn't this great that we have democratized self-making, that self-making is something anybody can do. And, you know, once upon a time, it was only the special person, the divine person, the dandy who could be a self-maker. But now it's anyone has a smartphone, as 90% of Americans do, and can share a picture of themselves lovingly curated with the outside world. The flip side of this is that I think that self-making has become a kind of expectation, and it is an expectation that doesn't like get us very far. It provides us with certain kinds of capital in an economy that is, for many of us, increasingly rooted in the attention economy, rooted in gig work, rooted in constantly selling ourselves over and over again to put together middle-class lifestyle rather than a few people having the kind of vast fame and fortune of, say, the Hollywood star. And I think that as self-making has become an expectation economically for pretty much anybody who's ever had to think about personal branding and networking, the more it becomes not really something we do freely or out of love of beauty or out of a desire to create an artistic product, but just, creating ourselves in a factory line. And I think while one can be very critical, and rightly so, of wildy and dandy culture and the way that it treats the dandy as like a special figure who is above the rules, something that I think that dandyism does really well is that in an era of increased mass production and mechanical reproduction, in an era of industrialization where people are feeling kind of alienated from this changing, modernizing world around them, the dandy says, I am me. I am an original. I am not a factory creation. There is something about my self-making that affirms my dignity as irreproducible and irreducible human being. And I think that there is something beautiful and moving in that, even if we see it as a kind of reaction to a society where that seems to be less and less possible. And the idea that what was once an affirmation of resistance against an increasingly homogeneous, technology-saturated world has in fact become the engine of a increasingly homogeneous, tech-saturated world where, if perhaps you're familiar with Instagram face, the trend of having a certain look, whether through filters or whether through makeup or whether through plastic surgery, that there's like, if you want to be an influencer, you make your face look like this. This is, you can do it. Anybody, or hypothetically anybody, can do this. But suddenly the idea of becoming an original or emphasizing your own unique individuality is subsumed into this culture where, we're doing this like a job the way we would, we're clocking in to our personal branding time and clocking out the way we would for any other part of boring work.
Yeah, so the way to become different in the future is to stay out of it all, but then no one knows who you are. It's sort of a catch-22.
Absolutely. And I think about this a lot because, of course, when you are a freelance writer, like that is one of those careers where being online on social media, doing self-promotion is expected. It is important. Often when one tries to sell a book on proposal, one of the questions that an editor may have or a marketing team may have is, how many Twitter followers do you have? And so it's this sort of very bizarre negotiation of how do you preserve, first of all, a private life, but secondly, a relationship to technology or self-presentation that is, I was about to say authentic, but I'm very wary of authenticity of a concept. I don't know that it exists or is very useful or helpful. But how can you maintain as much of your sanity and soul as possible when the dictates of your career involve putting up your personality for public display and consumption, or making yourself into a character for your own economic profit? Even if it's not very much profit, even if it's just like being able to keep doing your work.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? My second podcast, Don't Miss This, takes you beyond the typical and the obvious with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Listen now to Don't Miss This on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. I think it would be wonderful if we could hear a little bit from the book.
Absolutely.
Do you want to give us a little bit of an idea contextually about what you're going to read?
Sure. So I will read, keeping in the French theme, from a section of the book about Honoré de Balzac. And this comes in a chapter more broadly about Regency England and about Beau Brummel, perhaps the first famous dandy, perhaps one of the first people who was famous for being famous. Now, Beau Brummel was a relatively middle-class individual who, by virtue of his unlikely friendship with the Prince of Wales, the Prince Regent, and later his own unique sartorial style, became an early celebrity and early influencer. And in this chapter, I talk about the fundamentally conservative nature of a lot of this dandyism, that this is Regency England and also early 19th century France, which I am now moving to, are places where social mobility is increasing. More, the middle class are getting wealthy in a variety of ways that were not necessarily true a few hundred years earlier. Trade, for example. So the question of having the je ne sais quoi, or the what's known in Regency England as ton, or style, becomes a really loaded one. Because importantly, it's not about being an aristocrat or having certain kinds of blood, but it's also not something you can buy. And this tension, I argue, is part of this reactionary dandy image. Someone who has a je ne sais quoi that is neither about aristocracy nor about money. So with that preamble, I'll start here. If there is an early 19th century manifesto for this type of self-creator, we can find it in French author Honoré de Balzac's 1830 handbook/novella Treatise on Elegant Living. Written 10 years before Beau Brummel's death, but well after his downfall, Balzac fictionalizes a visit by a group of French dandies to an elderly exiled Brummel. These young members of France's ton equivalent hope that Brummel will help them create a set of laws, a kind of aesthetic Napoleonic code for aspirant bon ton havers back home. But Balzac's Brummel refuses. Elegance, he tells them, can never be codified, precisely because real style is never democratic. Not all legs are called upon to wear a boot or a pair of pants in the same way, Brummel insists. Will there not always be those that limp? Those deformed or ignoble? The dandies, the, quote, people of elegant living, unquote, are the, quote, natural aristocracy, unquote, of any country. Balzac mournfully harkens back to the God-centered, hierarchical, medieval view of the cosmos he believes the modern world has lost. The moment that two books of parchment, i.e. the Bible, no longer stand for everything, when the natural son of a millionaire bath attendant and a man of talent have the same rights as a son of a count, we can no longer be distinguished by anything but our intrinsic value. Balzac, and Balzac's Brummel in particular, sees the figure of the elegant man as the culmination of the natural human need to find some sort of organizing principle, to identify the special among them. The aristocracy of style is a means of reasserting hierarchy in an increasingly democratic world. The elegant man, in Balzac's telling, isn't just a fashionable man. Rather, he is someone who restores to the world a sense of that old cosmos defended so vociferously by sumptuary laws. He is someone whose exterior sartorial expression accurately reveals something true and innate about himself and what is lacking in others. Speaking approvingly of elegant self-expression, Balzac tells us that, quote, the exterior life is a sort of organized system that represents a man as accurately as snails' colors recur on its shell. After all, Balzac asks, why would clothing always be the most eloquent of styles if it were not really the whole man, man with his political opinions, man with the text of his existence, man made into a hieroglyph? Here, too, we see a tension between authenticity and artifice. By curating his clothing in a stylized way, the dandy is authentically expressing something fundamental about himself, his grace and superiority. By creating his life as a public form of expression, by choosing carefully his clothing, his speech, and his physical manners, this man creates a vision of elegance that restores a sense of hierarchy, order, and divinity to a world that, Balzac implies, heavily needs it. But at the same time, the organized system doesn't come from God or from a sanctified social order, but simply from the elegant man's own desires. We're living in a divinely ordered world, in other words, but God is not out there in the heavens. Rather, he is within the self-creator. Balzac's treatment of the elegant man points to some of the contradictions bound up in the European vision of the aristocratic self-maker. He resists the socially fluid world of commerce and money-making, although, chances are, he has benefited from them, as Brummel, and indeed, de Balzac had. Balzac's father, born a poor artisan, had changed his name from Balsa to the better-sounding Balzac. Honoré himself had added the nobiliary particle. The elegant man's aristocratic manner is innate and inalienable, but nevertheless could, sort of, maybe, also be learned.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So I read on your website that you have a book called Here in Avalon coming out next year. Can you tell us a little bit about that and whatever else you have in the works?
Absolutely. Here in Avalon is my third novel. It'll be published in January 2024 by Simon & Schuster. And I like to call it a sort of a dark New York fairy tale with a bit of literary thriller thrown in. It is the story of two sisters in contemporary Instagram-saturated New York who one by one fall under the spell of a mysterious nautical cabaret troupe that leads a series of midnight parties from which people seem to never return.
Wow, okay. That sounds creepy, but also very intriguing.
It's a little bit of a love letter to New York.
So where can people find you and how can they keep up to date with you and reach out to you to keep up with what's going on in your world? You
can follow me on Twitter at NotoriousTIB or on my website, TaraIsabellaBurton.com.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Tara. I will include links to everything so people can find you really easily. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Dr. Tara Isabella Burton for such a compelling conversation. You can find Tara on Twitter at NotoriousTIB and on her website, TaraIsabellaBurton.com. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with award-winning author and screenwriter Steph Penny about her novel, The Beasts of Paris. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. This is the fastest and easiest way to help the podcast grow, which will help me attract more great authors to bring to you. Please also spread the word to all the people you know who also love to read. If you'd like to go even deeper, join our book club over on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio, where I invite authors who have been on the podcast to come speak with us about their books and delve even deeper into the secrets we couldn't spoil on the podcast. Thank you again, and happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.